Welcome back to another beginner hand engraving video. Today we're going to be comparing and contrasting hand engraving with laser engraving. Okay, there's going to be a ton of information in this video. It's going to be a little bit long. So there is a table of contents in the description below for those of you who are impatient and just want to jump to specific spots. Before I get started, I want to thank my Patreon supporters. Of course, they support this endeavor as well as my other projects where I make game controllers for people with physical disabilities. And I want to thank you for watching. I just love putting this stuff out there and helping people along in their journey to learn engraving. So let's go over what I'm going to tell you about today. If you're anything like me, the question comes up repeatedly, what about laser engraving? What about, whenever you're talking about hand engraving? Maybe it's the price that gets brought up as a difference. Maybe people just wonder if you're using a laser. Maybe you've seen people use lasers and you want to know the difference. In this video, I'm going to take you over the gear that you need to do each, the price difference, though that's going to be pretty vague, the process involved with each, and then finally just a conclusion comparison showing the results in detail under a microscope so you can see what the differences are between each. Now, if you're looking for a this is better than that, I'm sorry, they're just different. They're just not the same stuff. But to the end consumer, they're very similar and maybe sometimes they wouldn't know the difference. This video will hopefully help you decide which you want to focus on, if you want to do both, and it will maybe help you better explain to a client why one is cheaper than the other to produce, or what the differences will be in the final product. Let's start with the hand engraving side. Like I said, there's a ton of variation, but there are some kind of minimum things you need. This is the hand piece. You're gonna need one of these, and a lot of people kind of mentally stop here, but there's a lot that you have to get to go along with this. Then you have the gravers. You have the hand piece, you have the gravers. These are consumable. You're gonna go through a lot of these. These are the actual chisels that you use for engraving. Then you're going to need an air supply to power those. Of course, your budget will change depending on what kind of air supply you get. I love these California air tools because they are super quiet compared to like a cheap one you would get at Lowe's, like a Cobalt or something. They're still loud though. Then you're going to need magnification of some kind. Now, you could use a cheap set of visors, or you could use a microscope like this. And of course, I'm forgetting that you're going to need a way to hold your work in a vise. Now, I have videos on how to choose each one of these pieces with complete price options and stuff like that. I'll put a link to a playlist of those videos up at the top so you can check them out. But this is roughly what you're going to need to do hand engraving. You could do cheaper versions of all of these, but you're going to need something equivalent to all of these pieces. Let's talk about equipment for lasers. Before we get into that, a quick note about kinds of lasers. For the kind of stuff we are doing, you need a fiber laser. You're going to Google it, you're going to see diode lasers, CO2 lasers, and fiber lasers. You need a fiber laser. You're going to see some instances where diode lasers or CO2 lasers can mark stainless steel. That's not really comparable to the type of engraving that we want and we do, that is actually like burnt into the surface or carved into the surface, tangible, permanent. You want a fiber laser. This is a 20-watt fiber laser from Monfort Lasers. You'll find a link to this down in the description below. 20 watt is roughly the weakest you can get. You want that, or a 30 watt, or like a 50 watt. The higher wattage is just gonna let you engrave deeper faster. That's the only difference. Lower wattage one works just fine. It's just a little bit slower. And when you see how fast this goes, you'll see that's not necessarily so much of an issue. You're going to need a computer to run it. In this case, I use a cheap laptop that was like $300 or $400 maybe at most. Any computer will do, typically Windows. And you're gonna need exhaust. You're gonna need some kind of way to suck out all the fumes from the laser. I use a cheap duct fan here. With some dryer venting, I just hold it up to it. You can rig it up however you want or use a fume hood. But that's all you need for the laser side of things. Time to talk price. This is going to be fun, but it's going to be vague, unfortunately, because there's so many variables. What I'm going to do is probably aim for the cheaper end, kind of the cheapest stuff, and then just assume that the price can go up drastically from there. To start off with, you have the handpiece. If you want a handpiece like I have, which is considered kind of the cheaper end of things, you're going to be spending at a minimum at GRS about $400, but that's not exactly what I have. If you go to Steve Lindsay's website and look for I believe he calls it the Air Chaser or something like that, again, link down below, you're looking at about $800 for a handpiece that works pretty much exactly like mine. And again, that's kind of the bottom end of what you would want to be doing some decent engraving. After the handpiece, you're going to need an air compressor. As I said, I use the California Air Tools. The compressor that I showed is $400 to $500. You can get a cheaper compressor, but it's going to be several times louder. The combination that I use, that handpiece and that compressor, are nice because that handpiece does not require additional equipment. You can connect it directly to your compressor. So it's actually saving you some money there, getting that handpiece. So on top of those things, you're going to need some magnification. You can go dirt cheap with just a head-mounted visor for $20 or up to a microscope like I have. The microscope that I have was roughly $400, and that's very cheap for a stereo microscope. And of course, they go up to thousands of dollars. I have, videos for all the different parts of my engraving equipment. You can see a link to that playlist up above that'll take you through cheap to expensive options. After that, you're going to need work holding. This ball vise that I have is roughly $120, I believe. The prices change around a little bit on Amazon because I bought the cheapest. If you go to GRS, you're looking at about $400 or $500 for a cheap ball vise. You are going to get a higher quality, of course, with those ones you get from GRS. But for what I'm doing, the cheap one is suitable. Work holding, handpiece, compressor, magnification, and of course the consumables, the little gravers, those are, $10 a piece. It's not too bad for those, but you're going to want a selection of them. You're also going to need sharpening, which you can go cheap on and get stones for, $50 maybe, a full set of sharpening stones. And then there are additional nice to have things like I have templates for sharpening different angles, which costed me maybe a couple $100 total, but let's not even include that. Now, after you add all this up, you're looking at $1,000 to, upward $3,000, $4,000 for your hand engraving setup. So you can get into it much cheaper than a laser, but you have to also consider the time involved afterwards. Once you get your hand engraving set up, you're going to have to devote time to learning how to do hand engraving and getting good at it. It's going to take you years. Even if you have a natural affinity to doing fantastic work, you might be able to do some decent stuff right off the bat, but it's going to take you years to get competitively good. I don't consider myself competitively good. What you've seen me do in my other videos when I'm trying is what I consider to be kind of bottom of the barrel whenever it comes to hand engraving. If you want to see some good stuff, look up, Steve Lindsay. Masterengraver.tv is a good place to see some tutorials on how to get good, hand engraving forums. There are all kinds of places you can find examples of great hand engraving. So there's the cost breakdowns. It may be cheaper to get into hand engraving. You could possibly, if you really wanted to argue, you could possibly just buy a push graver set for, $100 or $2 and start there. But the time investment to grow the skill is going to be the major cost, in my opinion. Do you have a year of your life to get good at it, to be able to market it as a skill you can sell? A fiber laser from Monport was just under $3,000 for the laser itself. You're going to need the laser. You're going to need an exhaust fan. I've found them for about $50 and about as high quality as the one that I showed you, maybe even higher quality with like speed controls, which might be nice. And then you're going to need a computer to run it. So let's say $300 to $400 there. So you're looking at about $3,500. There is going to be some time investment when you get a laser. You're going to have to do things like align and make some software adjustments to make sure that everything is lined up properly. I would say give yourself maybe a day to figure out what all the buttons mean, get your laser aligned properly, and then you're ready to rock and roll. You're going to be engraving that day. It's time to go through the actual process of doing each style of engraving. To start both, you're going to need a design. Whether you find something online or draw it yourself, you're going to need a design. I wanted to use the same design for both, so I drew up this real quick piece of scroll work. Don't judge me, I did this quickly. I didn't really put much effort into it, and I don't feel like going back and putting much effort into it. If you'd like a video on how to do prettier scroll work or the basics of scroll work to get you started, let me know in the comments down below, and maybe I'll do that one day. For hand engraving, the process is as follows. First, you set up your work holding, no big deal. You sharpen your tools, no big deal. A little bit time consuming. You get all your settings right on your air, no big deal. You get used to that after the first couple months. You kind of know where to set it. And then you transfer your pattern onto your metal if you're not just drawing something from scratch right then and there. That takes a little bit of practice. There's a whole video on how to do that up there. Once you've got your image transferred to your metal, you start the actual engraving. This can take a little bit of time, depending on the complexity of your model and your skill level. I am just going to blast through this as fast as possible, and I'm going to leave it nice and bright. I'm not going to fill it full of paint in the grooves, just so you can see it really well on the microscope afterwards. With the laser, once you have your image, you load it into your computer, you set the size to what you need, you set the parameters for the material you're running, you put your piece on the plate, set your focus, and hit go. That's really about it. You're going to have to experiment a little bit on your settings to get the material results that you want out of, different metals have different results with the laser at different settings. But that is really the gist of it. Check out how fast this goes. And that really is the laser process. There's just not a whole lot to it. You can be up and running with the design actually in the metal in less than 5 minutes once you're familiar with the interfaces. Just a quick side note, the software that comes with the lasers is fine. It's okay. A very nice upgrade to get is called Lightburn. There will be a link to it down below. It's really just software that's more up-to-date and more feature-rich that works on any kind of laser that you get. Not required, but it's really nice to have. All right, time for the comparison. I realize this is what most of you are really here for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by the naked eye, because that's really what matters. Then I'm going to move into under a microscope, and then we're going to zoom way in on a microscope to like the size of a human hair and compare to see how they're different. Before I get started, some caveats. It's immediately evident that the way that I'm testing this is leaving out a lot of the possibilities with hand engraving, like engraving, three-dimensional sculpting, different effects you can do with different shapes of hand pieces, the graver itself, different angles, different shapes, different textures you can put on it. So, this is maybe a bit unfair or simplistic, but this video is for beginners, and beginners aren't going to be doing most of those things. So if you're doing carving of three-dimensional acanthus leaves and doing hammered backgrounds and inlays and things like that, you're already an advanced hand engraver and you already know the differences. So, don't come at me. So let's go straight into comparison by eye. I'm going to describe this because the camera does not actually pick it up very accurately and very well. The laser engraved one is clean. The lines are dark and easy to see. However, it is very two-dimensional. Everything is exactly the same depth. It is an accurate portrayal of the image I drew, and since this one I did is hand-drawn, it does look kind of hand-carved somewhat, but everything is the exact same depth. So it is a bit flat looking. The hand engraved one is, some of the lines aren't as perfect because whenever I went to hand engrave it, again, you're relying on your skill, not the laser. However, what I see here, the biggest difference is the hand engraved one catches the light. The light glints out of those engraved lines, and that's because the hand engraver pushes through and carves a smooth surface like a V through the material that allows it to reflect light if you leave it as a bright cut. I've done a little section here where I added paint into it as well for a more complete comparison, and what I can see is that I can vary the line width a lot more by hand than I can with the laser. As we get down under the microscope, you'll see what I mean. You can actually get finer lines by hand if you take your time than you can with the laser, technically. All in all, this hand engraving was a rush job with a single graver at just, a quick plow through. It took me about 25 minutes total. So a time comparison, you've got maybe 5 minutes and you've got 25 minutes for roughly the same product. Some strong points for each. Laser engraving gives you the option to do things like photographs, whereas doing hand engraved, you'd have to learn very, very detailed stippling, and it would come down to your skill to be able to reproduce a photograph. Laser engraving, you can just do a photograph. You can just throw it into the software and do it. Hand engraving, of course, you could do some 3D sculpting and some inlays. There are lasers that can do 3D engraving, but they're much more expensive, several $1,000s to start for 3D. And you can't really do inlay with laser unless you work in hand engraving principles, so you might as well just be hand engraving at that point. For just a simple 2D line work design, I kind of like the results off the laser a little better. They're a little prettier. But if you're gonna, bright cut for fine jewelry is just gorgeous. And so, neither of them are a winner or a loser, they're just different. Let's look at them under the microscope. First, we will start with the laser cut. See, very nice, at a glance, very nice lines, matches what I drew pretty well. It seems like there's a tiny bit of burnout here from a little bit of poor focus, right there on the edge. But overall, very clean. Now this is zoomed out. This is the hand engraved. So this is the portion in which I did not put any paint. So this is a brighter cut. You can see my tool was a little dull, but it did cut prettier. This differs from the design because as you're hand cutting, you wing it. You do things like add some 3D effects and stuff like that. And then here's the section that has some paint in it. You can see the lines are much finer, but really not a ton of difference here. Now let's zoom in even closer. Okay, once we zoom way down in, you can see this here is the part where I added paint. This is the hand engraved one. And let's go down to some areas where I did not add paint. Now look at this. This is a smooth cut on the edges. This is a V cut into the metal, so it's going to reflect light. It's going to be shiny, it's going to reflect light. Also, the variation here in width, we can get down to a very tiny line. So like this right here, let's see if I can get a human hair in there for comparison. That's a human hair. So hand engraving, you can get really fine. Now I was in a rush and I was using a rather large tool. But you can see that's actually thinner than a human hair at the tip there. So now let's look at the laser cut. This is the laser cut. These are the fine lines. Let's see if we can find one that's supposed to be very fine. There we go. There's kind of something there. We can get down to roughly the size of a human hair here. There's a human hair. So we're down to about the size of a human hair for our fine cuts. Fatter than what you can do with hand engraving. And you'll notice these are, they're just a straight cut and they're burnt. So you're not going to get any reflection from inside there. You're just going to have, dark lines. In conclusion, to compare the two, As far as cost goes, you can get into hand engraving for pretty cheap if you just got some push gravers, but let's say you wanted the pneumatic setup that the professionals are using. At your absolute cheapest, you're looking at about $1,500 and up. And by the time you were to get a nice hand piece and nice compressor and nice work holding, you're probably at a similar price to the $3,000 laser engraver. Now the $3,000 laser engraver is the bottom of the line. As I mentioned before, the laser engraver, it's just going to do 2D work, but it can do stuff like photographs. You can, lay out text in different fonts and stuff a lot easier than hand engraving. It doesn't require as much manual skill. Hand engraving, you can do things like inlays, 3D sculpting, different effects and textures a lot easier that involve reflecting of the surface. Those things you're not going to be able to do very well with a laser. Hand engraving, though, you are going to have to spend time becoming a skilled artist in that specific art form. It's going to take you, years, at least a year to get halfway competent. So bear that in mind. I'm not going to tell you which one you should do, but I could say if I was going to be starting a business doing engraving, I would probably get a laser and use that to fund and support the business while I learned how to do fine crafting. If you want some examples of what I mean by fine hand engraving, look up Sam Alfano, Joanne Ryall, and some other people I will link down in the comments or in the description down below. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned something, or I hope this video was useful to you in some way on your journey into engraving. Be sure to leave me a comment telling me what else you'd like to see, or giving me your thoughts and feelings about laser engraving versus hand engraving.